Is the UK producing enough scientists and engineers? Are the government and private sector spending enough on research and development? And how does innovation translate into internationally competitive industries and well-paid jobs? The UK Innovation Report from Cambridge Industrial Innovation Policy tracks these important questions and more. The report, released annually, puts the UK's industrial and innovation performance in a global context and brings together in a single place innovation and value-added indicators in a concise and accessible format. To remain competitive and thrive, the UK will need to modernise today's industries and reduce carbon industries whilst nurturing the industries of tomorrow. This will require a clear understanding of the interplay between innovation and industrial performance, making the UK Innovation Report an essential resource.
Hello everyone, an ominous silence there. Thank you very much for joining us, both in the room and for all of those of you who are joining online on this glorious first day of spring. But I guess for people online who are in the Southern Hemisphere, this must be the first day of autumn. But neither way, it's a great day. So I have to do something very important first. This is not for online, only in the room. In case of fire exit is there and there. Go down the stairs outside. I should let everybody know that this event is being live streamed, but also recorded. And this recording will be made available via our website after the event. And you'll get a link sent to you once we've done a little bit of editing. So I'm Tim Minshall. I'm from the University of Cambridge Institute for Manufacturing, and I'll be chairing today's launch of the 2025 UK Innovation Report. And so clearly this is a very interesting time for innovation and industrial policy and industrial activity for the UK, given all the things that are going on that don't need explaining here. But my role is just to go briefly through the agenda before handing over to those who have the real knowledge and real content here. So this welcome will finish very shortly, and then I'll hand over to Lord David Sainsbury, University of Cambridge Chancellor, and also the former UK Minister for Science and Innovation, to set the scene for what is for the report itself. Then I'll hand over to Dr. Carlos Lopez Gomez, Head of the Policy Links Unit at the Institute for Manufacturing, to draw out the key findings from this year's report. Then we're going to switch to a panel discussion. I'll introduce the panelists at the time, but the idea there will be we have a series of themes we'd like them to comment upon. But then there will also be time for questions from the audience too. So if you're, as we're going through this, please be thinking up and reflecting on any possible questions, both for those in the room and also online. Of course, please have your questions ready too. And our colleague Elizabeth will be monitoring those questions and making sure we do come to those as well. We'll then wrap things up at about 5:25, giving you time to go back to other things you're doing. And I'll summarise roughly what we've covered during the afternoon. So, without further ado, could I please invite Lord Sainsbury to set the scene?
Thank you very much. I'm extremely pleased to have the opportunity to highlight the importance of the UK Innovation Report 2025. I think it's one of the extraordinary things that while economists cannot agree why in the last 35 years the UK, in common with other G7 countries, has had a low rate of economic growth. In fact, the explanation is very simple. Around about 1990, three main economies in the world began to be transformed into dynamic market economies. Deng Xiaoping started introducing major market reforms into China. Finance Minister Manmohan Singh started liberalizing the Indian economy, while the Russian Federation collapsed, and countries like Poland, which had a history of being a market economy, suddenly started flourishing again, and German companies particularly started putting their manufacturing plants there because of the cheap labor. And this meant that the G7 countries had to face a vast increase in competition from these huge countries, which have learned how to make the same products and goods as we do, and do so while paying very significantly lower wages to their workers. And the basic question we have to face is how should we respond to this? I think it's obviously nonsensical to think that the way to compete is by trying to lower the wages of the workforce in a race to the bottom. Instead, we should try to compete in what I called in a report that I did for Gordon Brown, to compete in a race to the top. That is, we have to move into the more knowledge-intensive, more difficult areas to be in, where our skills and knowledge can give us still some kind of competitive advantage. There is basically in the world economy a ladder of economic development, with at the bottom very labor-intensive industries which do not require much knowledge. That's industries such as cheap clothing, plastic products, and toys. It's in these industries that developing countries start their economic development, and because it's easy to compete in them, they have low wages. Then at the top of the ladder, you have industries like pharmaceuticals and AI, which are very knowledge-intensive, and because it's more difficult for companies and countries to compete in them, and because their value added per capita is much higher, they pay higher wages. So what one has to try and do in this world is move up that ladder of economic development into the higher, more knowledge-intensive, higher wage paying industries. Now the question is, how do you do that? And the answer is because it is innovation that really makes the difference, because it's an innovation that enables a country to move up the ladder of economic development, and that means it is the real engine of economic growth. I think still too many people think that investment is the real engine of economic growth. But actually we live in a world where investment, capital investment, is incredibly mobile around the world. You can sit in London and invest your money in Silicon Valley if you can find the right investment people to do it with. You can sit in London and invest in Chinese venture capital if you want to. That's a bit more tricky nowadays because the Americans are putting a bit of heat on this particular issue. But the point is, capital investment will go, and it goes to the places where there are companies which are successful and producing world-competing, innovative products. In that world, it's clearly innovation is the key engine of economic growth. And that's why I think the innovation report produced by the Institute of Manufacturing at Cambridge is so important. I think this year again, Carlos Lopez-Gomez and his team has done an excellent job, and the report includes a number of very important charts for business leaders and policymakers. I would in particular draw your attention to something which is called the Hamilton Index, which is part of chart 34. This particular index, most of the figures are produced by the Innovation and IT and Innovation Foundation in Washington. And it's a very interesting index because what it does is shows the extent to which a country's industries are concentrated in the knowledge-intensive industries of the future. Unsurprisingly, I think if you know anything about the international competitiveness of countries, you would not be surprised that in 2020, Taiwan, Korea, Singapore, Switzerland, and China were in the top 5 countries. These are the countries with most of their industry in these knowledge-intensive industries. I think the one country that people might be surprised about is in fact Switzerland. But that is only because most of us have a totally false view of Switzerland, which is essentially, it's an economy which runs on dirty money and moving money around. In fact, interestingly, it's a country which has maintained a very high level of very sophisticated manufacturing industries, and this is what has enabled it to be very successful in manufacturing, and indeed to have a strong rate of growth in recent years. This shows why we face a massive challenge in this country and why the government's growth strategy needs to focus much more on innovation and how we can strengthen our position in the knowledge-intensive industries in the future. It's not enough just to be saying, we want to be more innovative. We have got to be innovative in these knowledge-intensive industries so that we can compete against other countries who are also aware of this situation and are trying to move up in these knowledge-intensive industries of the future. I think the government's industry sector strategies can make a major contribution to moving up this ladder of economic development, but they will need to focus on sectors and not on groups of industries such as those they categorize as advanced manufacturing, which have in fact rather little in common. I mean, it's an absurdity to have a strategy which covers both the car industry and the aerospace industry, because these have very, very different strategic needs. Aerospace, we do have potentially a competitive advantage and something we can build on. The car industry is not in that position, and there is no conceivable way that we can be a leading player in that field. I think it's also true that in these sector industry strategies, they need to be created from the bottom up by people in the industry who actually commit to a strategy of innovation rather than just being set up by panels of officials and businessmen from a range of industries. This has to be done as they do it in Singapore with real bottom-up approach from industry. So clearly, if there's one message, I think, in all this, it is that it's not going to be easy, but if we know what we have to do, it should be much easier. And I think the UK Innovation Report 2025 gives us a mass of information about what we need to do, and then therefore is an extremely important contribution to this discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lord Sainsbury, for setting out the context so nicely for us. Good afternoon. I'm Carlos Lopez Gomez. I'm part of the Cambridge Industrial Innovation Policy Group, and it's my pleasure to be here today to introduce the UK Innovation Report 2025. I'd like to first thank the team that put together this report, that made this event possible. You can see their photos here. They're sitting around that side of the building, so please save your toughest questions for them, perhaps after drinks, or during drinks, rather. And of course, thank you so much for being here today, for taking the time, especially those who have to travel to be here. Now, what is the UK Innovation Report and why does it matter? There are plenty of reports that are looking at innovation and a great number of indicators that are trying to measure innovation. But what the UK Innovation Report aims to offer is a clear, accessible resource that helps bring together the dots, connecting the different databases that we have at the national and international levels. So we try to do this in 3 ways. First, we curate key indicators that give us a picture of the UK's innovation and industrial landscape, benchmarking the UK against leading economies, and providing a data-driven evidence base to inform policy. So ultimately, we want the report to be just more than statistics. We want it to be a tool for national dialogue that helps inform industrial and innovation strategies. So this is the 5th year of the report, and we're pleased to see it increasingly referenced in industry reports as well as policy documents. Now, this year's report includes around 50 charts divided in these 5 sections that you have on your left. You'll be pleased to know I won't go through the 50 charts, but rather I'll cover 5 key messages that capture the most important findings. Now I'll go one by one on this. So key message number 1. This is a defining moment for UK's industrial competitiveness. This chart shows the shares of global manufacturing value added for the G7 countries and China over the last 20 years. Once upon a time, the year 2000 to be precise, the G7 countries collectively accounted for around 56% of global manufacturing. However, by 2022, I think it's already mentioned by Lord Sainsbury, this share had dropped to just 33%. So a decline of nearly 23 percentage points. Meanwhile, China, which is in blue in this graph, went up and surged from 6.4% to 31%, making it the world's leading industrial player. So this is a staggering shift that we have seen in just over 2 decades. Now, what you see in this moving chart is the top 15 countries in the world by manufacturing value added. You can clearly see China going to the top quite quickly. And in 1998, the UK was ranked 4th in the world. By 2023, it had fallen to 11th place. So the UK's share of manufacturing value added dropped from 3.1% in 2002 to 1.9% in 2022. You'll see that it's not just China. Countries like India and Indonesia are rapidly becoming major players as well. Now, there are many issues with composite rankings and indicators, but we have included a couple of them in the report, specifically looking at the industrial competitiveness. So Lord Sainsbury has already mentioned the Hamilton Index. And what the Hamilton Index says is that in the last 20 years, the UK basically has lost the global market from 4.4% to just 2.6% in a selection of 10 advanced industries, including manufacturing and services industries. But this other index is the United Nations Competitive Industrial Performance Index. It measures the capacity to produce and export goods, technological sophistication, and overall impact on global industries. So as you can see in this table, the UK has gone from 11th place to 15th, which is another proxy for this declining competitiveness that we have been discussing. Meanwhile, China has gone up, along with other economies such as South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and Malaysia. Now, this chart shows global export shares in selected industries, with the UK in red, G7 countries in yellow, and China in blue. So the trend is clear. If you look at China, the blue line, China's export share has grown rapidly, particularly in computers and electronics and machinery and equipment. For the UK, we can see that the decline is most pronounced in industries that have been historically strong in the country. So, pharmaceutical sector, the UK is one of the top UK's export industries. It saw its global export share drop by 5.3 percentage points, while transport equipment, which includes aerospace, maritime, and railway equipment, declined by 4.2 percentage points, as you can see there. Now, but let's be clear. All this doesn't mean that the UK's manufacturing has shrunk in absolute terms. And it's still comparable to countries like Italy and France. However, the decline serves as a wake-up call. The UK still has world-class capabilities in a number of high-value sectors, but reversing this trend will require a huge effort in the context of growing global competition. So a key conclusion from this section of the report is that the UK's industrial strategy offers a historic opportunity to focus efforts and rethink how to revitalize high-value industries in the UK. Now, key message number 2. Manufacturing is receding, but it's still vital to the UK economy. Now, the report shows that manufacturing value added as share of the GDP, of the total economy of the UK, has reduced by around 40% in the last 20 years. So from 15% of the economy to around 9% of the economy. However, this chart shows that in terms of capital investment, manufacturing remains the largest contributor, followed by construction and education. This doesn't include real estate. Now, this chart shows the critical role of manufacturing in raising UK's productivity. Alongside ICT and finance, manufacturing is among the fastest growing in productivity, with significant gains in transport equipment, machinery, metal products, and automotive between 2010 and 2022. Now, this chart looks at employment and salaries. So the last column on the right highlights median salaries. Green, if they're above the national median, and red, if they're below it. Just a couple of observations on this one. So this one here, healthcare, retail and administrative services, which are these ones highlighted in red, accounted for over 1/3 of all UK jobs in 2023. Yet these sectors pay below the national median salary. As you can see, that's what they're in red. Among higher paying sectors, manufacturing employment has nearly halved over the past 20 years, losing 6.3 percentage points. And you can see professional services actually has gained some ground. So it has grown by 3.2 percentage points, but this increase has not offset the job losses in manufacturing. So this means that we're seeing another worrying trend. A growing share of UK workers are being employed in lower paid sectors. So a key takeaway from this chart is the need for a data-driven approach, recognizing that both manufacturing and services are important for the UK economy in variables like investment, productivity, and jobs. Now, some sectors aren't contributed as much as they used to, not because they have become less productive, but because they're shrinking. It's not that these industries are bad for the economy, as some suggest. Rather, we should see this as losing something valuable. So we need to ask, what can be done to retain and strengthen high-value industries in the UK? Key message number 3. The UK is a leader in government support for business R&D. Now, this is a simple chart, but it provides an overview of the UK's expenditure in research and development, showing the sources of funding on the left and where these R&Ds perform on the right. On the far right, you see the famous 2.77% of GDP. This is the UK's total R&D expenditure as a share of GDP, or GERD, for those that like acronyms. So putting this into global context, the UK's R&D spending is higher than the OECD average, which is good news. However, it remains 16% lower than Switzerland and around half that of the Republic of Korea. Now, if we break down these components, let's get rid of that bit there. The business sector in the UK funds 62% of all UK R&D. But this is higher in other countries, like US, in Japan, much higher in Japan. Also, we see another thing that is different in the UK, which is that the UK's higher education sector performs 23% of total R&D, which is more than twice the share in the US and Japan, which tell us about the bigger role that academic research plays in the UK. Now, from a policy perspective, what is important to look is the flows. So especially this bit here, which is the bit that the government controls. So the ONS breaks it down into government and UKRI on the left. But if we look at the part that is highlighted there, we see that OECD shows that the UK's government direct funding to business sector R&D is equivalent to 0.15% of GDP, which is above the OECD average of 0.09%. If on top, in the next chart, that is the yellow bit that we saw in the previous graph. If on top we add the indirect support through tax relief, we see that the UK provided the highest overall level of government financial support for business R&D as a share of GDP among OECD countries. As you can see in this chart, that's why the UK is number one in there. This reached 0.48% of GDP, which is more than double the OECD average. It is important to note, however, that 2/3 of this support came in the form of R&D tax relief, and only 1/3, or less than 1/3, through direct funding. Now, this trend reflects a broader trend across all OECD countries, or most OECD countries, that are increasing the share of R&D tax incentives. However, this is particularly striking in the UK. So, if we compare to the UK system, to the US system rather, the US tax credit scheme cost only 1/3 as much in relation to GDP as the UK's. Of course, there's more money there, but in relation to GDP, it costs only 1/3 as much in relation to GDP as the UK's. R&D tax credit now costs the Treasury around £7.6 billion a year. So some people actually call this the UK's flagship industrial policy. So all of this raises questions about R&D funding distribution. The OECD calls not only for larger investment in R&D, but also greater directionality in research and innovation to achieve national missions. So they argue that agnostic policy support, including R&D tax credits, favor incremental rather than radical innovation, and mature rather than breakthrough technologies. Now, key message number 4, UK's industrial workforce presents high tertiary educational attainment, but persistent skills mismatches. Now, in 2023, the UK workforce reported some of the highest level of qualification and skills mismatches among OECD countries. So let's see this survey data here. It shows that 37% in red of UK workers believe their qualification exceeded the level required for their job. 34% of UK workers felt overskilled for their current role, and 41% of workers report their field of study is not related to the most relevant field for their job. So, and you can see all of those are above OECD average in gray. Another important thing to notice is that despite having one of the highest tertiary education attainment rates, the UK has a lower share of workers with a vocational education. In 2023, 60% of 25 to 34-year-olds in the UK held a university degree, compared with the OECD average of 48%. However, only 22%, you can see the 22% in red, pursued vocational education, well below the OECD average of 31%, and significantly lower than other European peers like France, Germany, and Italy. Now, this is of course all relevant because addressing qualification mismatches and producing qualified technicians will be critical to closing skill gaps in high growth sectors and ensuring that the UK is able to supply the workers needed in future industries. Now, key message number 5, finally, which is that the UK is a leading innovator in renewable energy technologies. Now, the UK has been consistently among the top countries with the highest public R&D expenditure in low-carbon energy technologies between 2013 and 2023, according to the International Energy Agency. The agency estimates that in 2023, as you can see in this graph, the UK spent in these technologies was around $1.8 billion, which is lower than France, Japan, and the US, but higher than Germany and Canada. Among low-carbon technologies, the highest public R&D expenditure in the UK in 2023 was in nuclear power technologies, energy efficiency, and renewables. However, here it's important to note that most of the actual production of these technologies is taking place elsewhere. For example, China is responsible for as much as 75% of production of things like batteries and solar panels, and with a growing share in newer products like electrolyzers. So the key question here is how to leverage the UK's strong position in innovation. And it's important to say this is just an example of one area, but we see this in other areas as well. How to leverage this position as an opportunity for future industrial growth. Now to wrap up, just a recap of the 5 key messages and the big question they pose for the future. Now first, this is a defining moment for the UK's industrial competitiveness. Global competition is intensifying, but the UK still has world-class capabilities in key industries. The UK industrial strategy and the sector plans present a historic opportunity, but beyond the usual indicators like investment, R&D, and startups, their true success will be measured perhaps by one key metric, and that is whether they can reverse the UK's lagging competitiveness and restore its position in high-value industries. Second, manufacturing is receding but still vital. Rather than getting caught on a false debate between manufacturing versus services, we need to focus on the data and recognize how these sectors reinforce each other and contribute to variables like capital investment, productivity growth, and job creation. Ignoring manufacturing's role in the economy contradicts UK's national policy goals and weakens the broader economic landscape. Third, the UK leads in government support for business R&D. But the big question is, what is the right balance between grants and tax credits to drive the goals of the industrial strategy and in specific sectors and subsectors? Fourth, despite high tertiary education levels, the UK still faces skills mismatches. Competing in future industries requires closing these gaps and boosting vocational training. So much is said about this, but how well is this problem understood in specific sectors and subsectors? And finally, the UK is a global leader in renewable energy technologies and other technologies, but how can we turn this strength into future industrial growth? Now, that concludes my overview of the UK Innovation Report 2025. Of course, there's much more in the full report, now available on our website. You have printed copies with you there as well. And please visit our website. We have a newly launched UK Manufacturing Dashboard as well, which is a new online resource which will be updated annually, looking specifically at manufacturing and its broader impact. Please have a look. Do get in touch if you would like to discuss. And now I'm delighted to be joined by a fantastic panel for discussion. I look forward to hearing your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Carlos, and thank you, Lord Sainsbury, for setting the scene so well. Could I now please invite our panellists to join Carlos on stage? And just to remind everybody, as we're going through this, or as you're listening to what you heard from Lord Sainsbury and from Carlos, any questions you've got, just start thinking about how you might like to frame them as we get to the open discussion. Now, first of all, thank you to our panellists for joining us today. We know you're all extremely busy people, and we're very grateful for you being here. But to start off, could I just ask each one of you to briefly introduce yourself, starting with Oliver.
Hi, I'm Oliver St. John. So I'm the Deputy Director from the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology, who heads up the department's Innovation Ecosystem team.
Hi, I'm Andy Parry. I'm based in the Department for Business and Trade, where I lead on innovation policy and the service sectors in our industrial strategy unit.
Hi everyone, my name's Kate Fairhurst. I'm the Head of Policy at Make UK, and we are the trade body for manufacturers.
Hi everybody, I'm Grace Atkinson. I'm the Head of Strategy for Atlas Composites, and we're an SME manufacturer of composite materials and tooling in Derbyshire.
And you're still Carlos.
I'm Carlos.
Great. Thank you very much. And perhaps a particular note of thanks to Kate, who's been stepped in at the very last moment due to a colleague unavailable to attend. So thank you very much, Kate. But also, Andy, you also were a late arrival, and we really much appreciate your time and your flexibility. Right, so the way we normally and usually start this off is by asking each of our panellists, having had a chance to look at the report, having seen the 5 key themes brought together by Carlos. Anything that you found particularly surprising? So the report always presents the data and looks at some of the things that are going well and some of the things that are perhaps more challenging. But maybe, Oliver, would you care to comment on anything to kick us off?
Whole thing. Yes, there's always a high risk if I say I'm surprised by any of this, I'll get fired, given it's supposed to be my day job. I think what I said, again, I'd really re-emphasise the report is enormously useful for kind of us as policymakers, incredibly helpful to kind of draw this stuff kind of into kind of an accessible format. I think what always kind of leaps at me is like, we see the kind of trends and indeed some challenges that I think we all kind of know about in this sort of space. And the government is really aiming to respond to those through our growth mission, through the kind of new industrial sort of strategy. What leaps out at me is that there are opportunities there. There are ways for the UK to seize that kind of future advantage. Carlos talked about, actually, we are really good at investing in business R&D. We have a good baseline of support that absolutely is the foundation for developing those kind of competitive capabilities that we want. When you look at data around the STEM workforce, actually there are really positive trends there about that growing and being there as a capability that the UK can draw upon to seize those advantages that Carlos kind of talked about. My only sort of thing that generally surprises me, so that as a policymaker in this space, is this slight frustration I always have about the weird ways we sometimes classify data. I personally hate SIC codes. And it's a problem we always run into, I think, as policymakers in this space. There are actually emerging and better ways we can examine the kind of data about emerging and new kinds of sectors. Not a criticism report, but more like a thing that surprises me, like collectively, we haven't sort of, we don't do more and more effectively.
Thank you. Andy.
So a bit like Oliver, I wouldn't say anything surprised me as such. A lot of the reflections in the report are quite similar to the insights that have come through our consultation on the industrial strategy, and it's a really helpful comparison. Maybe three reflections I thought were quite interesting. So on skills, the point around mismatch I found really interesting. As part of, we know from what businesses have told us that skills is a key part of delivering growth. That mismatch of where we compare with the OECD and have individuals that feel they're overqualified for what they do needs to be incorporated as part of the wider effort on making sure we've got the necessary skills for the next 5, 10 years and beyond. I was also interested, there was a stats in relation to business R&D spend comparing manufacturing with services. I was interested that actually that they were quite similar. I think it was 48% for manufacturing, 47% for services. And I suppose my reflection there was when we think of R&D and innovation, it's really key to not just think of kind of traditional R&D spend in that regard, and that when we think of the 8 sectors within the industrial strategy at least, there's professional business services, creative industries, how their R&D spend is particularly key to consider and how we kind of drive that going forward. And then thirdly, it was just the international comparisons, not one in particular, but it really kind of made me reflect that, as Lord Sainsbury mentioned at the start, we really need to kind of focus on the areas of UK strength where we can achieve strategic advantage because the landscape is so competitive.
Great. Thank you. Kate.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, like the other two speakers, much of the report findings align with what we hear every day from our members at Make UK. But there are areas that are especially interesting from our point of view. For example, where the UK sits internationally, which nations are growing and which are not. Some of you may have seen that last year Make UK did a piece of work to say that the UK has fallen out of the top 10 for manufacturing nations, and we now sit at number 12, which was quite a change given that we'd been climbing up the ranks the previous year and even leapfrogging France. And in light of that, we did a report again at the start of this year to say that manufacturers, in spite of that, are still really optimistic about the landscape. They want to invest, they want to grow in the UK, and they're really passionate about it. So I suppose the interesting question is, in light of all the information that we know, is UK manufacturing dropping, or are other nations growing? And we think in the case of us dropping to 12th place, it's probably more the fact that other nations are seeing strong growth. For example, we saw Mexico enter the top 10 for the first time, who have benefited from huge Chinese investments made in the first Trump presidency. So whilst we can't be complacent, and we're certainly not, we need to strive to get back into that top 10, and our manufacturers are primed and ready to do that, and we just hope that the government can give them the right policy landscape to do so.
Great, thank you. Grace?
I think you've all covered the points that I wanted to raise. There was something that you brought up, Carlos, and I even put the page numbers of the report that I wanted to refer to. But when you mentioned about China and the fact that they've got such a high market share now, I'd actually wanted to comment on that, because even though you look at loads of goods that we buy and it says made in China, actually seen statistically written down with a graph with this change in shape. I've gone from 4.7 to 23.5% of global value-added market share. It's just staggering in 20 years, and I think that really resonated with me. And whether or not, I think Lord Sainsbury just summarised it perfectly. We can't race to the bottom. They are doing things that, and as you said, Tim, they've got lower cost labour. We can't compete with that. So that stood out. Skills match mismatch. I've just got written down very sad, because it makes me feel really unhappy when you read that people feel they're overqualified for their roles, and how are we as a nation allowing that to happen? So that resonated a lot, and that's something we really do need to focus on, not just for manufacturing, but for all sectors. So yeah, I think you guys have covered everything really. I don't think I've got anything else to add.
That's brilliant. Thank you for that. And did you want to add anything at this point, Carlos, given that you identified these issues?
No, okay. Thank you.
Just thought I should give you the chance. So if we maybe start to push forward a little bit and look at this issue, and starting with the global competition side of things. Things are getting increasingly, I was going to say the word hostile, I don't mean that, as aggressive competition, and it's presenting numerous challenges. Can I just stick with you for a moment, Grace, if I may, and say from your perspective, being in a manufacturing business, any comment you wanted to make on that about what things we can be doing to ensure that we do remain competitive?
I think certainly for us as a small company who predominantly supply into the larger organisations, we've noticed that our access to any type of funding is challenging. So when we say about the R&D direct funding, it's an interesting one. I don't want to go into it too much in this context, but geographically where we're located, we don't see a huge amount of that, because it ends up going elsewhere. We're based in Derbyshire. I'll let you put those things together. So it's challenging in that it's difficult as a small organisation to innovate and to be funded to innovate if you don't have enough funds internally to enable that. Certainly the impact of the minimum wage increases has been a real challenge, and even more of a challenge with the national insurance hikes. Yep. So there's also the CBAM regulations that are coming through and what have you. So there's just, it feels like there's an enormous number of things are all happening at the same time that do make it very, very challenging, particularly as a smaller organisation, to be competitive. Most of our business is domestic, so we don't export a huge amount, but I don't think we would be able to do that successfully at the moment, just because we can't on price really, and I don't think we can really compete on an understanding of the requirements of the new legislations as well. And again, we need a bit more support from the primes that get a lot of funding, particularly in aerospace, to assist us with ensuring that we can actually meet the demands of the supply chain and flow that down. CBAM scares me a little bit, and the fact that it's just happening and there isn't really much hand-holding. But we have to find a way of being able to monitor all of our emissions and our entire supply chain and what have you. And it's a big challenge when you haven't got a large resource pool or a large pot of available funds. So sometimes what is classed as innovation globally and ticks the boxes for an innovation grant isn't actually innovative for a smaller organisation. Some things that are kind of almost generic are relatively innovative to enable the organisations to progress. So I do sometimes fear that we're going to get left behind a little bit as smaller organisations.
So is it, there's issues of the general competitive environment which has been made more difficult because your cost base has risen, and I guess also energy costs?
Energy costs is horrific, yeah.
I know, Kate, that Make UK have been highlighting this particular issue as well of energy costs.
Yes,
Yeah.
no, we have. Energy costs are huge. It's the number one concern of our members going into 2025. And just to echo what Grace just said, from our members' point of view, all we're hearing is that the cumulative impact of different pressures from all sides is making the competitiveness of the UK hard, whether that's regulation or whether that is costs. We've just done a paper on how government might look to simplify regulation in the UK. I could throw lots of acronyms out there, CBAM, EPR, and all of them that our members talk to us about every day. And if manufacturers are thinking so hard about how they can tackle these ever-increasing costs and burdens and regulatory frameworks, they're not thinking about innovation and growth and all the things we want them to be thinking about.
Right, so it's, I guess, coming back to your point, Grace,
Yeah.
you've got those two things of the increased cost base and the burden of many things happening at once, with the essential need to innovate as well.
Yes.
Particularly challenging for any company, but particularly if you're an SME.
Yeah.
And then where you're located affects that as well.
It does,
Yeah.
it does. And I think if we can get more support from the government with regards to enabling these shortcomings, it puts us in a much better position. As you quite rightly said, you know, you can't innovate if you haven't got the resource or the funds.
This is a perfect segue into the next point. Thank you very much, Grace. Which is, if we look at those figures of declining manufacturing activity, depending how, again, to your point, Oliver, about how that's measured and the impact, the distorting effect of SIC codes and the changing nature of manufacturing notwithstanding, given that advanced manufacturing is one of the 8 growth areas in the Green Paper that is leading to our industrial strategy, I just wondered, maybe starting with Andy, any comments about where we need to prioritise activities to ensure we deal with this issue of, if it's a growth sector, we hear the challenges happening there, what can be done about it?
Sure. So, I mean, ultimately, it will be a mix of a range of different factors to kind of drive a strong business environment. But I suppose three reflections from me would be, firstly, around technology adoption, discussing kind of colleagues in the office this morning around, you know, on the one hand, the UK has huge strengths in robotics, but when it comes to advanced manufacturing, it's companies aren't kind of adopting robotics to the same extent. The stat, please correct me if incorrect, I was told this morning is kind of 109 robots used in companies for every 10,000 people, which I found quite a surprising fact. And so work is ongoing kind of within government. Got the Chief Scientific Advisor and National Technology Advisor kind of leading a technology adoption review, which will help support the industrial strategy, really kind of identify the funding, the skills, the behavioural changes required to kind of really increase tech adoption, not just in advanced manufacturing, but across kind of our sectors. So to kind of extend that slightly to others, I mean, the use of artificial intelligence, even just kind of enterprise software, kind of accounting, customer relationship, all of these kind of things to really apply technology as far as possible to increase productivity. Secondly, there's something around access to finance, I suppose it kind of builds upon this and helping companies really navigate the valley of death, the cliche there, and making sure that financial institutions, be they public or private, are aware of how to kind of, giving them the information, the support to kind of take more risk, basically, and understanding that for manufacturing, for hardware investment, understanding that where that's such an initial upfront cost, that there's long-term value to be there. But again, kind of away from manufacturing, also understanding how to value the intangible assets that organisations have, and making sure that from a, be it the British Business Bank or the National Wealth Fund or kind of financial markets more broadly, that it's really clear that the access to finance can be provided there. And then skills, I think, would be my kind of third reflection. I'm sure we'll probably talk about it lots more, but being clear what the skills pipeline is through to 2035 and beyond. And so understanding what skills we need now to address the immediate challenges, but also in 10 years' time when things will be completely different too.
Very interesting. So there's that double issue of getting organised, getting manufacturing, getting all firms using the technologies we already have, the adoption side to it, but it has to be done in parallel with the driving forward of the innovation as well. And it's both of those things you're saying need emphasis.
Yeah, I mean, that's the whole package. It's never one single thing, yeah. Everything in collaboration.
Interesting. Well, given that to do those things requires some government spending on that, with industry spending as well, this issue that Carlos identified and his team identified of this huge amount of public spend on the tax credits. Oliver, can I just get your thoughts on that and whether that's being used in the right way and targeted in the way that's most effective, and whether there could be things done slightly differently then? Just your thoughts on that.
So I think when I think about it, it's really important to recognise that businesses value a diversity of mechanisms to support them, because there's a real, I think, danger as policymakers thinking that every business works in the same way, is going through a linear pathway, and we all know that's not how innovation works, and it's not how businesses think or operate in practice. So it's really important that we provide them with like a diversity of incentives and support that can speak to the particular issues they are facing at any kind of given time. And that can take a wide range of forms, from R&D tax credits to kind of directed grants through to focused investments in kind of innovation infrastructure, like the catapults that we fund and allow kind of businesses to access. I think it's very fair to say, in the world of an industrial strategy, and with the sort of, the sort of competitive advantages that we want to kind of seize, it's very reasonable to say, actually, we could do a better job making our incentives more directed. And that has real power, because it's not just, I think the point that's been made, about government's spend on R&D. What actually allows R&D to have an impact in the real world and create business growth are all what we might describe those kind of pull-through factors. It is whether your regulatory system is effective for businesses. It's whether your NHS is buying the products that your innovative medtech companies are producing. And a more directed approach, I think, can allow, and this is absolutely what the intention of the industrial strategy is, can allow you to align those different levers behind your investment to deliver kind of greater impact. But it's just worth remembering, as remembering as well, that you also have to give businesses that flexibility. You have to remember that over the long term, new sectors emerge, new technologies come to the fore, and we have to create the space in our R&D system and our support for it that allows the things that government didn't prioritise now, but it should do in the future, to bubble up and become the successes of 20 or 30 years' time. Hopefully that makes sense.
That's a great point. And it's having that flexibility to not be focusing on the key sectors we have now, vital though they may be, notwithstanding observations made by Lord Sainsbury earlier, but also to have the flexibility to say, as new industries emerge, how do we understand what's going on, let alone where to target things? So flexibility being key, I'm taking from that. Did you want to add anything on that so far, Carlos, before we head to something that I know will consume quite a lot of time, which is the issue of skills? Anything you want to raise?
Well, when we developed the report, we talked to companies, we talked to industry associations, and I think I do recognize this point about competition and how many companies believe that they're not in competition with a region in Germany or a company in Singapore, but sometimes they're in competition with the whole industrial strategy of other countries. And car company was telling us, well, we compete to the whole lander strategy of this region, right? And I think to the point that you mentioned and the flexibility of the variety of mechanisms, I think the sector strategies, sector plans could have a great role there if we identify, there's something that brings sectors together. There's some knowledge, some skills, around a product, around some knowledge type. But the companies are different. Smaller companies probably cannot access some of those big R&D grants, but they require other types of innovations, like whether it's lean or they're just spending on energy efficient technologies. So we see it as a pyramid. A sector is a pyramid in which you have at the top those smaller number of companies that will access those big R&D tax credits. And then we have kind of the basis of the pyramids. Many companies don't have R&D departments. engineering departments or design departments. So it's very difficult for them to apply for those grants. But in other countries, you will see that they get support from the land there or from the prefectures in Japan to do that basic innovation activity. And that's why I think the sector plans have a great potential if we look at it as something that brings them together, but at the same time, the variety of companies and the different types of support that are required for them.
Really interesting. And so, if I may, Kate, from your perspective, representing a large number of industrial organisations, any reflections on that?
I think, our main driver for the funding side is making sure that small and medium-sized firms have the support that they need. We've just done a report on how SMEs can be helped to scale up, and we found that if funding is targeted in the right place, an additional 83 billion can be added to the economy, and it would take us back into the top 10 of manufacturing nations, and it would take us to, in fact, number 7. And a lot of what we did was mapping out what the funding is and where it is. And there were 2 problems that kept cropping up, which was firms being continually unaware of how to access the funding. And it was the problem of having cold spots across the country where perhaps funding is more inaccessible than others. So we think it's really critical that government's aware that the landscape is patchy, has a plan to address it, and wants to plug the gaps that are there.
Any other comments on that before we move to skills? So that's really helpful. There seems to be a key message there, which is back to Oliver's point. It's a variety of mechanisms needed, and the flexibility is needed. And there is great. It's a very diverse environment we're talking about here, from the smallest company to the largest company, across sectors that exist, sectors that are emerging, sectors that don't yet exist, but we know will in the future. So to skills. And I'm going to turn, where to begin with this? So we've all, I think, agreed that seeing those numbers writ starkly there and having that international comparison really is quite an eye-opening moment. But do we understand what the problem really is? And do we know what we could do about it? And I hope this isn't unfair, but Grace, turning to you first, any thoughts on that, on either of those points?
I don't think people do understand what the problem really is, because we can see that there is a gap. We don't have enough people in manufacturing. We've got people who are overqualified for their jobs but don't have the vocational understanding, etc. But actually the requirements that a company like Atlas need are very different to, Vestas or somebody who are a much bigger organisation. And I think so the skills that we need now, I think we were talking about what we need now and in 10 years and what have you, we need now to be able to catch up with where the larger players already are, just with understanding digital technologies. So there's the Made Smarter programme, for example, we're part of that, and that's been wonderful, because to get on board with the Made Smarter programme, there wasn't a huge amount of red tape to get through, which was great because we don't have people available to do that. But also it highlighted the fact that we are, as an organisation, and I don't think we're any different to most SMEs, is there's a lot of digital technology that's out there that we don't know about. And there's a reference to advanced manufacturing, we keep talking about that, but what does it actually mean? And it hasn't really been clearly defined what advanced manufacturing is, and has it deliberately been left open to cover the point that Oliver made, because it's going to change with time. But certainly I would class what we do, even though it's quite hands-on and we do low volume, so robotics isn't necessarily the skills gap that we need, because we don't do the volume to warrant that capital expenditure. But certainly automating our processes and having more streamlined digital understanding, that is of huge benefit. So actually the skills that we need are not necessarily what one would think. They're not necessarily apprentices who are going to do the hands-on work. They could be software engineers that help bring stuff together. Right. So it's recognising the fact that manufacturing doesn't necessarily always need what you immediately think, because the landscape is changing. So it's supporting each area with what they need, which, as I said, might be different for a small company to a large company.
So given that heterogeneity, that difference of needs
Yeah.
across multiple things. Can I bring you back in, Oliver, with your earlier comments about this need for a diverse set of approaches there? And skills does seem to be particularly challenging and particularly requiring quite a sophisticated approach.
So I think all I'd say, I mean, is that first I think there's a real point harking back to what Lord Sainsbury said about being industry-led skills space. The government's doing a lot in that space to sort of, you know, to align your skills system with what industry, and particularly sort of industry regionally, is telling you that it kind of requires to kind of develop those high growth clusters around the UK of the future. My reflection would be, it always strikes me as really important to sort of, you know, I think it's a dangerous policymaker, so you can sort of see like R&D and innovation policy over here and skills policy over here. Like, you know, they interact, but we don't necessarily always design them to be part of a kind of coherent whole. I'm really struck, one of the programs we fund are the Catapult Centres. You know, they are training thousands of apprentices, and that's an extremely effective model, because there you have like an innovation asset focusing on cutting edge skills, working with businesses at the kind of very frontier, but who are in parallel seeking to train the next generation of people really skilled in using the latest bit of technology, the latest kind of machinery. You may well say, you know, not everyone can access Catapult to the extent that they would like. There's always limited capacity, but that concept that you deliver those interventions trying to hit multiple objectives, driving innovation in key sectors and building the future skill set, seems a really powerful model for me.
And this, I think, is something that's been here since, Carlos, the very first report, this issue of skills. But exactly as you say there, that slight problem from a architecture and plumbing of government point of view, that these things are regarded as slightly separately funded and separately supported activities. And just to pre-warn Andy here, we'll come to comments about that in relation to the industrial strategy in a moment, if we could please. But first, Kate, from your perspective, this issue of skills from a Make UK angle, I mean, it's something that's massive for all of your members and is talked about constantly. Do you feel we're moving in the right direction with this?
Yeah, I've not been at Make UK very long, and I've not had a single day where I haven't talked about skills with our members. It is the thing that they talk to us about, and it's the sector's Achilles heel, frankly. If I may, going to give a shameless plug to a massive piece of work that we're currently doing, the Industrial Strategy Skills Commission, which we're due to launch in just under 2 weeks, which has been a huge evidence gathering exercise. We've toured the country, spoken to employers, to apprentices, to colleges, to skills organisations, anyone who's interested in this, to get to grips with what they need to grow and thrive. And we're going to be coming up with a set of recommendations for the government to hopefully press forward with, to reverse the decline in apprenticeship starts and make sure that the skills landscape is friendlier to manufacturers. So hopefully the government's ears will be pricked on the 1st of April, not an April Fool, and we'll have the report winging their way. So yes, all in all, it's incredibly important, but hopefully we've got some ideas.
Perfect. Segue into Andy.
So it kind of echoes what's been said, but I mean, the industrial strategy is not going to be successful if it's just government alone. And a lot of what we're doing is making sure that, listen to what industry are telling us, that they are kind of, as we deliver not just the industrial strategy, but the kind of the 8 growth driving sector plans, that industry are a core part of delivering that. So, you know, skills will be throughout the strategy and the sector plans, and so making sure that we understand exactly what the needs are at all levels of sectors will be key. So it just feels a really good example of why kind of industry-government co-working is essential.
Great. And just to let people know, we'll be turning to the audience after this comment from Carlos. Carlos, would you care to make anything else you wanted to say about on the skills side that you didn't cover already, or in reflection to what you've heard there?
I think I'll go back to this point of the system, of the sectoral system and national system. I think, again, looking at how it works in other countries, what are the institutions throughout the country in the different regions that are supporting manufacturing firms, not only adopt new technologies, but perhaps with training, you know, with apprenticeships. And yes, when we look at and we compare the UK with other countries, you have, in the US, these systems of manufacturing support in every single state. So, they claim to cover 11% of all SMEs in the country, which is a massive number. So that means every single state at least have a center where they can go for support for skills, for training, but also for things like Made Smarter type support, right? So I think that was quite striking that the UK, throughout in the last few years, decades, that institutional support, that infrastructure of support has been eroded to a certain extent. I mean, it was MAS before, Manufacturing Advisory Services, and I know people don't like to talk about it, but things have, if you compare to other countries, then you'll see, well, companies in Japan will have this kind of support, companies in the US will have this kind of support, and then again, we need to think about sectors competing against other sectors in other countries with that support that is related to technology and to skills in the regions. And yeah, the Made Smarter program, as you mentioned, is, I think many companies are welcoming the news that will be national now, but of course that has taken time. And in other countries, all they had to do is to use their existing institutions to deliver support in the regions. Whereas obviously the UK has to take those steps to rebuild these institutions of support in different regions.
Great. Thank you all very much for that. Now, over to the audience, both in the room and online. If you're in the room and wish to ask a question, could you raise your hand, please? And then a microphone will come to you. Is that because we need, oh my goodness, several microphones, several questions. Could we start first here and then there, please? And then I think there are two more. Yep, and there. Right. Please, sir, could you state who you are, where you're from, and your question, please?
Yeah, sure. So it's John Saltmarsh. I'm now at the Energy Systems Catapult. One comment and one question. The comment, it goes back to the skills mismatch bit, which are some scary numbers. I note that they're actually self-reported. And if you ask people whether they think they can do a better job than their boss, 69% of people reckon they can do a better job than their boss. So that's even worse than the numbers you're looking at there. But no, my real point is it's around procurement, and it goes back to the comment that I think it was Lord Sainsbury made about the stuff. We're world leaders in wind turbines, but all of them are manufactured abroad. How can we sort of change procurement policies so we end up buying factories to produce cable and buying factories to produce transformers, rather than simply buying transformers and cable which get made elsewhere, for example?
Great, thank you very much. Can I think it was Carlos, you'd said in your data about this issue of leading but actually buying from elsewhere. Can you just clarify if we have got that right before I hand it over to others to respond?
Whether we have what right, sorry?
The issue of we're leaders in renewable energy technologies, but actually we're purchasing a lot from overseas.
Yeah, I mean, I think the point was, it's an example of other technologies where the UK, invented here, produced elsewhere, kind of phenomenon. Yeah, I think obviously renewable energies, there are some clusters of activity in the UK, Scotland and others, but yeah, it is right. I think in the procurement side, I think one mistake that sometimes we made about procurement is taking the whole government expenditure and saying this is available. It is not available. Most of it goes to salaries or to things that are committed. So I don't know exactly on which sectors we haven't done this work exactly on which sector it has the ability to change the dial in procurement. But yeah, I think many people fail to recognize that the budgets are not as big as they seem to actually purchase things, but it might be true in certain sectors. But this is about global industries as well. Procurement will be an element, but yeah, the market is rather global, and the clients need to be global.
To Oliver or Andy, any comment you wanted to make on that from a public procurement perspective, or support for private sector?
So, I mean, a couple of thoughts. So, firstly, I would really like this concept of we need to pull through the R&D and innovation that we produce into impact in the public and the private sector is really key. Not just for helping the firms producing that innovation, but for actually making the public and the private sector more productive. And I think that's a real kind of focus of this government. I mean, on the specific issue, so we've had the very recent Procurement Act that has a big focus on, from the public sector point of view, trying to make many more tools available for commercial teams in the public sector to work with SMEs to deliver procurement processes in a way that is far more accessible to smaller, more innovative firms, to the point that's been made, who don't always have the time to go through really complex, complex processes. I think alongside that, there's a really important thing about sort of the way that the government signals the sort of its demands about what it requires, and that I think is a kind of longer term behavioural thing across the public sector that really requires sort of delivery teams to be going, I'm going to require this outcome in 5 or 10 years' time, and to take quite an open approach to articulating what that outcome is, so that actually there's lots of opportunities for the private sector and innovative firms in particular to go, well, because you've framed it in a relatively open way, I can tell you a bunch of new and exciting ways to deliver that outcome that you probably hadn't thought about. Beforehand. So I think a real behavioural aspect to this and a behavioural change. I think absolutely this government is really leaning into is going to be kind of critical. The final thing I was going to say is just that generally, whether it's in the public or the private sector, I'm always really struck by the importance of like the cluster or the region in this space. I often go and speak to kind of companies who talk about the importance of their local kind of supply chain, and actually, if you've got this manufacturing firm being built next to this medtech firm who needs somebody to manufacture the sensor for their thing that allows them to sort of to detect toxins in someone's blood. Actually, that kind of networking effect at the local level is incredibly powerful for allowing firms to work together, to allowing you to procure in the UK, and ultimately to land many of the positive impacts that we want from stuff being done in the country rather than overseas.
Brilliant. Thank you for that. Did you want to add anything to that, Andy?
No, go ahead. Completely agree.
Great. Thank you. Right. Next question, Bear, please.
Thank you. My name is Tim Page, and I run a small economics consultancy called Industrial Paradigm. Carlos, I was interested in your slides where you showed labour productivity in manufacturing rising, but jobs in manufacturing falling. Is that always going to be a straight, whenever productivity goes up, jobs go down, or is there a way of making, or would it be desirable to make manufacturing more jobs intensive, given that it creates so many high-quality jobs that other industries don't create? That was my question, but I'm also fascinated by these international industrial competitiveness rankings that show Germany going from second place to first place and all the other G7 falling. Do we know what Germany does so well that it always competes? Is it a myriad of things? Is there one thing that we could really learn? Because we've been here, even 3 months ago, people said that Germany's economic model was going to fall off a cliff because it relies on Russia for its energy and America to buy its manufacturing products. And now they're about to spend an awful lot of money on defence equipment, so their economic model is likely to sustain. I mean, what is it that they do so well? Is there a lesson for us there?
Carlos, it's all on you now.
Those are simple questions. Yeah, I think in job intensity, I think we have an issue with language as well, with productivity, the issue of productivity. More productive firms don't necessarily always fire people. That's why manufacturing is still 30% of GDP in Korea, and over 20% in Germany, in Singapore, Japan. They actually have targets to keep more than 20% of their GDP in manufacturing because they understand the implications for productivity and for jobs. So it is, manufacturing is just the nature of the type of activities tend to be productive, but to remain productive, that means they need to be competitive. And again, who are the countries that have more robot intensity you talk about, Andy? I mean, again, it's Korea, it's Germany, it's Japan, it's the countries that still hire enough people, a large amount of people in manufacturing. So it's not like that the more manufacturing you have, the more technological sophistication you have, the fewer people you hire necessarily, because you get market share and then you expand operations and then you hire more people. So yeah, I mean, that is quite clear that some jobs just, especially in some regions, and especially those that don't require a university degree, and there's a whole debate in the US about this, as you know, but that's why it's been called the ticket to the middle class, those jobs in manufacturing regions. And many people argue that many of the geopolitical changes that we have seen both in the US and in other countries have to do with the loss of jobs in those regions, certain type of jobs in those regions. Now, yeah, but Germany is quite complex. Of course, one of the things is that the data that we show is only until 2020. Things have changed a little bit, especially because, for example, we had a great discussion with the team about automotive industry. So automotive industry, it is really affecting Germany. The rise of China in automotive really was just in the last 4 years. China was almost not exporting anything, very little, but in the last 4 years, 5 years, it's just increased massively, mainly because of EVs and how they're affecting now Germany. So we will see the numbers a bit different if we look up to 2023 for Germany, but still, of course, it has underlying capabilities. I cannot tell you exactly what all of the aspects of the model, but one that I highlighted is the systems of support in Germany. Obviously, the Fraunhofer is an order of magnitude bigger than the catapults, and they have other things like standbys, like technical universities. Vocational training is very strong in Germany, and a job in industry is well seen in society, right? I usually have people with STEM degrees running the company rather than finance. Many things we can highlight, but I think all of those are proxies.
Yeah, we're going to spend the rest of the day just talking about Germany. There's a book published by, I think, the FT correspondent with the completely neutral title of Kaputt, talking about. But this great point about that things, as you say, have changed very recently with the situation in Ukraine. So I think there's definitely two more questions. Two hands went up, but can I just turn to Elizabeth first to see if there's anything we've got online before we come to you two guys here, please?
Yeah, another one for you, Carlos. This is from Luke Mackel from the OECD. Do your team look at whether there is anything unique or striking about industry-academia linkages in the UK STI ecosystem? It would be good to see if there's any similarity with other G7 or OECD countries.
What linkages between?
The UK STI ecosystem, between industry and academia linkages in the UK STI ecosystem.
Right. Well, another easy question. I think when we looked at the Sankey diagram, I mean, one interesting thing that we see, we try to compare the UK in terms of that funding. Where is the government spending the money? And what is interesting is actually in another project that we're working on right now, and my colleague David is leading that project, so you can ask him later. But it's about where does that funding actually go? So the question is, which sectors is R&D prioritizing in the UK? How does that compare to the sectors, high growth sectors in the industrial strategy? And whether it's applied or basic research. So I think those are key questions to understand the STI landscape. There is a perception that the UK funds more basic research and rather than applied. That has to do with the issue of scale up. And then the OECD measures experimental, which is another category of research as well. They measure basic, applied, and experimental. So in that project, what we're trying to do is where in this level of maturity the funding is going and to which sectors is going. We see some things that are not surprising. The UK tends to fund more aerospace. That's not surprising because this is strong. But there's issues that, like machinery and equipment, that a huge chunk of the funding goes there. And it's interesting because it's not kind of something you will think of. We also see that, for example, food and drink, which I think is the Food and Drink Federation talks about this very openly. They don't get as much funding as other sectors, despite being a huge sector in the UK. But when you look at the research intensity of the sector, it's actually more research intensive than other countries as a sector. So I think if we take sector by sector comparisons, that's why it's important, and we can probably continue in that.
So your basic answer is people should talk to David.
That's the main thing, yes.
Fine.
I should have said that.
One question there, and then one here, please. Please.
Right. I'm Balaji Srimulanathan. I'm the Director for Aerospace and Space at ADS, which is the trade body for aerospace, defense, security, and space sectors in the UK. So, look, firstly, I'd like to agree with some of the points raised about energy costs. So we are multiples expensive compared to our nearest competitors, France and Germany, for example, and, you know, we don't know where we'll land against the US with all the reversal of policies there. So we might be 6 times more expensive than the US. So it might affect competitiveness for manufacturers, especially if you're export-led. We stand no way to compete against the Americans. But just going back to the question around, or the point that Dr. Carlos made around, we seem to be doing a lot of R&D here. We don't seem to industrialize this effectively in the UK. I think that's an issue that's not just hitting SMEs, that's an issue for bigger companies as well, right? So in aerospace, we've managed to anchor a lot of capability here. It's a high barrier sector. UK has a competitive advantage. We need to grow that. And it's a big market uptake waiting to happen, and we continue to invest. However, there is that question about industrializing here. How do we make sure that that continuity of support beyond, in government terms, TRL 3 to 6, which is, you know, a historic way of defining that value of death. Things have moved on in other countries where, you know, government industry co-investment goes beyond those fussy boundaries of TRL 3 to 6 to later stages of innovation and demonstration and closer to market stages. That is absolutely missing in the UK. You know, to your point, that scale-up issue and funding. And it's not scale-ups for startups, it's also scaling up for industrials. Often, you know, we find ourselves historically, industrial strategies too focused on startups, you know, and not really focusing on incumbent SMEs or mid-tier manufacturers as sources of innovation at all. It was always, oh, if you're not a startup, you're not an innovator. Is this industrial strategy going to do something different in that regard? And that's my question. You still have the same marginal pound issue, you know, fiscal constraints exist, so how is this going to be different to previous strategies?
Well, I'm afraid... Sorry, Andy. Any comment you care to make on that, but also any of our panelists on that particular issue of scaling up?
So just to understand the question was how will the industrial strategy kind of support scale-ups, but not just focus on kind of the newer startups? I mean, if I've understood correctly. So, I mean, we've heard a lot from kind of consultation responses whenever I speak with businesses. You know, the UK is very good at startups and struggles with scale-ups, and so yes, that's absolutely an aim to address that through the industrial strategy. We recognise that often this will vary across different sectors as well, which kind of where the kind of the very sectoral focus of the strategy will come in. The scale-up challenges for an organisation in advanced manufacturing is different to professional business services. So having that focus throughout is key, and then it's kind of similar to the other points we've discussed here of making sure that kind of blend of different functions and support with government, be it regulation, skills, finance, comes together, and a lot of what we're doing is making sure that package fits, as well as making sure that we're continuing to speak with business to understand the specific insights where they vary across their sectors.
And if I may, Kate, is this something you're hearing from your members as well, this support, desire for more support for scaling things up?
Yes, it's absolutely crucial. I've already mentioned the Scale Up report that we did that outlined a series of ways that the government could look to target funding more specifically, and we're certainly looking to the industrial strategy to have some answers to that. I was actually saying to Andy earlier on that the challenge the government has for the industrial strategy is that the expectation is almost so high by this stage, and the challenge is to be all things to all people. So I don't envy the challenge, but we're certainly looking for scale-ups to be part of it, absolutely.
Oliver, from a DSIP perspective, anything you wanted to add to that?
No, so I just need to recognise, but I think that the UK is really good because it has a really quite amazing research base at spinning out and starting up new companies. And obviously, the great policy challenge is we want to capture the value of those ideas and those firms in the UK. That is why, like, complementarity between the R&D system and the wider kind of systems government use to support businesses is so critical. So we have like the British Business Bank that's making big interventions in the venture capital space, providing that kind of growth capital that is critical for a startup that gets to the end of its sort of Series A, starts to look to kind of Series B, Series C finance raises. We are really keen to make sure that that pathway of growth exists and that it's integrated together to allow those brilliant startups to become kind of scale-ups. So a really big focus at the moment. It will be a really big focus of the industrial strategy. It's a big focus of our thinking as we design the future of the R&D system.
Thank you very much. Now, due to appalling chairing, I've done a very bad thing, and I hope you'll forgive me. Our final questioner, would you mind putting your question here over? Thank you for your understanding. Yes, thank you. So I can't believe that's gone past so quickly. Thank you all very much. So I think there's just a few final points here. The main one being to thank you, audience, for coming along to this event, both in the room and online as well. To Lord Sainsbury for setting the scene so well, for Carlos and his team, but particularly Carlos for presenting that, but also to our panellists. So could you join me, please, in giving them a big round of applause? There's also been a huge amount of work to actually produce the report, so thank you to everybody who helped providing the data and putting it together. The CIIP team, the Cambridge Industrial Innovation Policy team, would be delighted to hear from anybody who has an interest in this area, and very happy to make contact and follow up afterwards. The report is available both in hard copy here, but also online. They, all of us, would love to hear comments back on that, and anything you can think of about not just what's in this year's, but how it could be improved or expanded in future years would be much appreciated too. But yes, please read it, please share your feedback directly with us or share online as well. So with that, could I say farewell to our audience online? Thank you very much for joining us.